Hey there, friends. Before we drift away into the slow rhythm of another time, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? I always wonder that. What city? What hour? What sound surrounds you as my voice reaches you across the distance? Maybe it's raining where you are. Maybe the streets are asleep, or maybe you're by the sea yourself, hearing the same slow breath of waves that I once knew so well. Because tonight, I'll tell you what it was like to be a sailor in the old Roman world. Not a captain, not a hero, just a man among many, born too close to the water to stay on land for long. And maybe, by the end, you'll feel the salt on your lips and the creak of the timbers beneath your feet, just as I did. I remember the harbor of Ostia at dawn, when the mist still clung to the hulls and the air smelled of fish, tar, and burning olive oil from the lamps that had not yet gone out. The merchants were already shouting, the slaves rolling barrels and amphorae, the gulls fighting over scraps. The water, pale and calm, reflected hundreds of masts like dark needles against the waking sky. I was young then, no beard yet, hands soft and foolish, and I thought the sea was just another road. I didn't know it would become my whole life. They called me Lucius, though on board a ship names rarely mattered. Everyone was boy, or you there, or pull harder. But I liked the sound of Lucius when my mother said it, before she sent me away with a small sack and a wooden charm against storms. The charm smelled of home for a while, then of salt, then of nothing. The ship was a merchant galley bound for Massilia, or so the master said. We loaded amphorae of wine from the hills of Latium, jars of oil from Campania, baskets of dried figs and salted fish. Every object had its smell, its texture, its weight. Every crate meant someone's coin, someone's risk. I remember the scribes marking everything with wax tablets, the overseers checking seals and arguing over taxes. And above all, the steady creak of ropes, the moan of the wind through the rigging sounds that would become my constant lullaby. When the sun rose higher, the port shimmered like a dream of gold and bronze. The soldiers on the docks wore their armor even in the heat, their helmets flashing like small suns. Fishermen were mending their nets, the women washing linen in the shallows, the air full of chatter and gossip and the calls of vendors selling dates, bread, and watered wine. I remember standing by the gangplank, watching everything I knew grow smaller. The tavern where I'd slept on the floor, the temple columns behind the warehouses, the narrow street that led back to my mother's house. I thought I'd be gone a month, maybe 2. I didn't know that the sea keeps men much longer than they expect. The captain, a man with a crooked nose and a scar down his neck, shouted the order to push off. The oars dipped in unison, and the ship shuddered, groaned, and began to move. The harbor slipped away, the shouts turned to murmurs, then to the whisper of waves against the hull. The coastline blurred into haze, and that's when it happened. That strange quiet moment when the land disappears and you realize you are surrounded by nothing but water, sky, and the uncertain future. The older sailors laughed at my wide eyes. They'd seen too many boys like me, dizzy with wonder and fear. One of them handed me a rope, told me to pull, and by the time I looked up again, Ostia was gone, just a smudge behind the wind. I felt both free and lost, as if I had stepped off the edge of the world and was floating into some endless story that had no beginning and no end. That was the first time I tasted the rhythm of the sea, slow, heavy, eternal. The waves rocked the ship like the breath of a sleeping giant, and every creak of wood, every splash of oar, became part of a song that would never leave me. We didn't talk much after the first few hours. The men worked in silence, conserving strength. The sun climbed, and the horizon stretched without mercy. I began to understand why sailors called the sea both mother and monster. That evening, when the sky turned the color of copper and the wind smelled faintly of far-off islands, I lay on the deck and listened to the ropes humming above me. I remember thinking that maybe the sea wasn't just water. Maybe it was time itself, flowing and flowing, carrying us toward places we hadn't yet dreamed of. And somewhere in that endless twilight, with the stars just beginning to show, I realized I would never truly go home again. The next morning, the sun was barely a pale slice over the horizon, but the deck was already alive with the rhythm of work. I woke to the smell of brine and tar, the salty tang mixing with the sweat of men who had been rowing before dawn, already hardened, already moving as though the ship were a living thing and a part of its flesh. I had never felt such exhaustion, not even after the harvests at home, and yet there was a strange excitement in it, a strange sense of belonging, as if each drop of sweat tethered me closer to the pulse of the sea. The master of the galley, a grim man named Quintus, had no patience for hesitation. "Pull!" he shouted, and the oars groaned in response, the water tearing past in angry little waves. My arms ached immediately, the muscles I didn't know existed crying in protest. And yet, the effort brought a clarity that I had never known. I became aware of the ship as an entity, the way the wood flexed, the way the ropes sang when the wind tugged, the subtle tilt of the hull that whispered where the currents were strongest. The older men didn't speak much, except to offer grunts of instruction or the occasional laugh at a mistake. I learned to tie knots by the feel of the rope, to read the sky by the shifting colors and the shape of clouds, to sense the coming of storms not by fear but by instinct. And soon enough, I understood that every sailor, no matter how proud or brash, was a student of the water, forever learning, forever guessing, forever listening to the pulse beneath the planks. Our first day at sea was uneventful in the sense of danger, but extraordinary in sensation. The sun climbed higher, and the waves rolled endlessly, each crest like a small mountain, each trough a valley of liquid shadow. I began to notice things I had never considered. The way gulls hovered in the wind, drifting lazily above the prow. The faint line of distant sails that suggested other lives, other paths, other stories crossing ours. The smell of the resin we used to caulk the seams, thick and pungent, mingling with salt and sweat. Every breath was a mixture of discovery and remembrance, and I felt, perhaps for the first time, that I was exactly where I was meant to be. The first minor storm came in the afternoon, and it was not particularly violent, yet the ship rocked as though it had grown restless, creaking and groaning under the strain. I remember the sharp cry of the captain, the coordinated shuffle of feet on wet planks, and the sudden realization that the sea was not just a road or a playground. It was a force, indifferent, demanding respect, willing to punish carelessness with a capricious cruelty. I clung to the ropes with every ounce of strength I had, feeling the spray strike my face, tasting salt in every inhalation, and listening to the older sailors shout instructions and curses, their voices cutting through the wind like blades. By nightfall, when the storm passed as suddenly as it had arrived, we were soaked, weary, and exhilarated. The deck smelled of wet wood, and the lanterns flickered, painting ghostly shadows across the faces of men whose lives had been forged by the same waters. I lay on the deck then, staring at the sky where stars reflected faintly on the undulating sea, and I understood, with a depth I had not known, why men returned to the water again and again, why they called it both mother and monster, why even in fear and fatigue they could not stay away. It was during these early days that I began to hear the stories that would follow me for years, whispers of other ships swallowed by storms, of treasures lost beneath waves, of strange islands glimpsed and never reached. The older sailors spoke in hushed tones, half superstition, half warning, and I listened intently, absorbing the rhythm of their speech as I absorbed the rhythm of the sea itself. Each tale carried a lesson, of patience, of vigilance, of humility. I learned that courage was not in denying fear, but in moving forward despite it, in rowing until the arms ached and the sun burned, in tying knots until the fingers bled, and in watching the horizon for signs no one else could see. And yet, amidst all this labor and fear, there were moments of delicate beauty. A calm morning when the waves mirrored the sky perfectly, so that the ship seemed suspended between heaven and earth. A sunset painting the water with colors that no painter could capture. A sudden sighting of dolphins racing alongside the prow, their bodies arcing like silver flames, bringing laughter even to the grimmest of men. I began to understand that life at sea was a mixture of hardship and fleeting marvels, a balance of suffering and awe, a rhythm that could humble and elevate in the same breath. By the end of that first week, I was no longer just a boy on deck. My hands bore the calluses of work, my body the ache of continuous effort, and my mind the subtle, insistent awareness that the sea would shape every choice I made. I was learning the language of waves, the meaning in wind and sky, the unspoken codes of the ship and its crew. I began to see that a sailor's life was not merely travel or trade, but a conversation with the vast, unyielding expanse of water, a dialogue conducted in sweat, in shouts, in the quiet moments when the stars shimmered over a restless sea. And as we sailed deeper into the Mediterranean, leaving familiar coasts behind, I began to understand something even more profound, that the world was much larger than I had imagined, that danger and wonder existed side by side, and that every man aboard that ship, from the captain to the youngest oar-bearer, was bound by the same invisible thread, the call of the sea, relentless and eternal. Life on deck settled into a rhythm that was at once relentless and strangely comforting. The sun, rising and falling in an unending loop, dictated every action, every pause, every sigh. I learned quickly that the deck was not merely a platform, not merely wood and nails, but a world in itself, a small universe suspended between sky and sea, governed by rules older than any law in Rome. We woke before the first glimmer of dawn, our bodies still stiff from yesterday's labor, our fingers numb from salt and rope. The oars awaited us, lined up in the water like obedient soldiers, and the first task was always to make them obey, to coax them into motion until the ship began to breathe with life. Water slapped against the hull, spitting tiny fountains with each pull, and our muscles ached even as the rhythm lulled us into a kind of trance. I came to recognize each creak, each groan of the timbers, as the ship speaking in its own tongue, warnings, comfort, reminders that it was alive and that we were part of it. Meals were simple, almost perfunctory. Hard bread, olives, salted fish, water or diluted wine. Nourishment more than pleasure. We ate on the deck or in the narrow hold, and even as we chewed, we watched the horizon, searching for signs of other ships, of storms, of land. Conversation was sparse during work, reserved for brief shouts of instruction or laughter at small, absurd mishaps. And yet, there were moments between the waves when stories emerged, whispered tales of distant ports, of treasures, of ghost ships and drowned sailors. Those stories held the crew together in a strange way, a fragile fabric of shared fear and shared awe, spun from salt and sweat and memory. Sleep was irregular, often a fitful nodding on benches or in hammocks lashed to the deck, with one eye open, ears alert for the slightest change in wind or wave. Dreams merged with reality. I would awaken to the creak of wood, the slap of water, and it was sometimes impossible to distinguish one from the other. The older men seemed immune to it, their eyes calm, their bodies unbroken by the ceaseless labor, their minds trained to anticipate the sea's every whim. I envied them and feared I would never reach such serenity, but there was comfort in their presence, a silent assurance that I would survive, that we would survive together. Tasks on the deck were varied, yet monotonous in their repetition. Cleaning, checking ropes, adjusting sails, inspecting cargo, patching leaks, each a small piece of the larger puzzle, each vital in its own understated way. And through it all, the wind and waves dictated tempo, sometimes slow, sometimes violent, always insistent. I learned to feel the subtle differences. A swell that warned of approaching storm, a shift in color that hinted at change, the faint hiss of water overboard signaling a leak unseen. Each day, the ship taught me, each hour revealed more about patience, endurance, and the silent power of nature. The crew themselves were a study in contrasts and companionship. Some were seasoned sailors, their faces lined, their hands gnarled, their eyes like glass reflecting decades of waves. Others were young and reckless, eager to prove courage, yet quick to be humbled by the ocean's indifference. We shared jokes, stories, quiet murmurs to ease the monotony, and occasionally songs, low, slow chants that rose and fell with the sway of the deck, echoing across the water in a harmony of survival and ritual. Through it all, I began to understand a truth that no teacher on land could impart. A ship is not a mere collection of wood and sail, but a living organism with a heart made of oars, a spine of masts, and a soul formed by those who inhabit it. Storms came and went, yet they were only moments in a larger pattern of repetition. Rowing, tying, watching, adjusting, waiting. The monotony itself became a kind of comfort. Even the sea, in its endless undulation, seemed to insist upon order, a steady pulse to which all life aboard conformed. And within that rhythm, I found not boredom, but meditation. I watched the waves, I counted them, I felt their weight pressing against the hull, and I realized that this was the true life of a sailor. Not the heroics of battle or the glory of discovery, but the quiet surrender to an ever-moving world, the gentle acknowledgement of forces far greater than oneself. Yet, there were surprises even in this apparent monotony. The sudden flash of dolphins racing alongside, the appearance of a distant sail, the smell of land carried faintly on a breeze, each tiny event breaking the repetition with wonder. And still, the routine returned. Adjusting ropes, keeping watch, hauling cargo, singing songs of longing, eating bitter bread, drinking brackish water. In those cycles, I began to understand that life at sea is both endless and immediate, each day a mirror of the last, yet never identical, always demanding awareness, endurance, and a quiet reverence for the invisible currents that shape it. By the end of weeks, I could anticipate the needs of the ship almost instinctively. I could read the subtle changes in wind and swell as easily as I read the expressions of the crew. My hands bore the permanent marks of work. My back ached in ways I had never imagined. My mind carried the constant rhythm of oars and waves. And though I was still young, still learning, I began to feel a bond with the ship and its people that transcended fear or fatigue. A shared understanding that in the vast, indifferent expanse of the Mediterranean, survival depended not on strength alone, but on attentiveness, on patience, and on an unspoken trust in each other. In those moments, standing at the prow as the sun climbed, feeling the spray on my face, listening to the low moan of the wind through the rigging, I realized that I was becoming part of something larger than myself. The sea was no longer just a road or a challenge. It was a teacher, a companion, a constant presence shaping the lives of all who dared to leave the shore. And in that realization, I found a strange peace, a certainty that, no matter how far we traveled, no matter what storms we faced, the rhythm of life on deck would continue, steady and unyielding, a slow, eternal conversation between man and sea. As the days stretched into weeks, the purpose of our journeys became clearer, and with it came the subtle understanding of the world beyond Rome's familiar coasts. We were not soldiers nor explorers, though sometimes the line blurred. We were carriers of goods, of stories, of small fortunes that slipped from hand to hand, port to port, across the endless expanse of the Mediterranean. Every amphora of wine, every jar of oil, every tightly wrapped bundle of grain carried its own story, its own weight beyond the physical. Some were gifts, some were commerce, some were burdens. And we, sailors and oarsmen, were their silent couriers, riding the waves as others slept or worked inland, oblivious to the vastness of the sea between them. I remember the ports vividly, though I barely stepped ashore in most of them. The harbor of Massilia welcomed us with a strange mixture of scents: roasting meats, damp stone, and the faint tinge of spices that hinted at Egypt and the East. Merchants in loose tunics argued over prices, while sailors, like us, exchanged news, warnings, and tales that only the sea could justify. Even the wind seemed different there, carrying messages from distant lands, rustling banners and palm fronds alike. Each port was a small world, complete in itself, yet always a prelude to another, always a brief interlude before the return to the relentless expanse of water. The voyage itself demanded every ounce of attention. Cargo had to be secured with precision, or jars would smash and wine would run freely, staining the deck and our sandals. We checked lines, adjusted sails, and measured the currents, always alert for the unseen hands of misfortune. Storms were a constant companion, sometimes sudden, sometimes creeping with a languid threat. And yet, even in the chaos of wind and spray, the act of keeping the ship in motion became a meditation, a slow, deliberate conversation between the crew, the timber, and the waves beneath. We carried goods to places whose names had always seemed exotic: Ostia, Puteoli, Carthago Nova, Massalia, the distant ports of Sicilia, and once, the hazy outlines of Crete in the early morning mist. Every harbor presented a new rhythm, a new language, a new pattern of human activity that fascinated and humbled me. The sailors learned quickly to read the docks, where the tides ran fastest, where guards were most vigilant, where the cargo could be unloaded with the least fuss. And in the markets, merchants bargained with the same intensity as the waves below us, each trying to wrestle some advantage, some coin, from the chaos of trade. Sometimes, on long stretches without land, I would imagine the journey ahead. I would trace the curve of the horizon, wondering what lay beyond, and wonder at the hundreds of ships that might cross our path, each with its own story, each with its own cargo, each with its own mixture of fear and hope. Some were slow, heavily laden, groaning under the weight of provisions. Some were swift, almost silent in their passage, their sails catching the wind with elegance. And all of them, in some way, reminded me that commerce was life, life in motion, the unseen pulse that kept empires connected, even across seemingly endless seas. I recall one afternoon as the sun bled orange into the sky, a breeze carrying the faint perfume of distant spices from the east. I watched the amphorae rocking gently in their lashings, the ropework taut under strain, the ship slicing through the calm water. A sense of time's elasticity struck me, that a week felt like a month like a year, yet every moment was immediate, full of presence, full of risk. And I understood why the merchants depended on us, why the ships themselves were considered vessels of not merely goods but of trust, reputation, and survival. The crew learned these things quickly. There was a hierarchy, subtle and sharp. The captain gave orders, but the seasoned oarsmen, those who had seen more voyages than I could count, carried quiet authority. They corrected a knot without a word. They anticipated a shift in wind before the master could shout. And they preserved the ship from disaster in ways invisible to the untrained eye. I absorbed all of it, learning to anticipate not only the sea but the human currents aboard. For the vessel's health depended as much on cooperation and understanding as on skill with oars and sails. Sometimes, we would sail past islands that appeared like mirages, their cliffs jagged, their vegetation dark against the light. Birds wheeled overhead, circling as though guarding secrets. The smell of distant land teased the senses, and the crew would speak in low tones of what awaited there. Traders, soldiers, women, taverns, or sometimes nothing at all. I began to realize that the sea carried not only commerce, but stories, rumors, mysteries. That each voyage was as much about the unseen and unknown as it was about wine, oil, and grain. And always there was the undercurrent of danger. Pirates, though rare in the early stages of my career, were ever present in our imagination. A shadow lurking at the edges of maps, whispered about by older sailors with solemn faces. Storms could appear without warning, and even routine crossings demanded vigilance, for a single misjudged wave could capsize a galley or smash a cargo hold open. Yet, within these perils, there was a strange exhilaration, a reminder that life was measured in both survival and awareness, in observation and instinct. By the end of these first voyages, I had begun to perceive the Mediterranean not as a body of water but as a network of lives, a tapestry of ports and people, of merchants and sailors, of currents and winds, of fortune and disaster. Every journey, every port, every wave carried lessons. And I, Lucius, a boy who had once stared wide-eyed at Ostia's harbor, was learning to speak the language of the sea, to read the signs, to anticipate the invisible rhythms that guided all who dared to cross her waters. The Adriatic appeared calm in the early morning, a glassy expanse stretching between the Italian coast and distant Dalmatian islands. The sun painted everything in pale gold, and gulls wheeled lazily above the prow, as if mocking our anticipation. But the sea is a patient teacher, and it waits, quietly, before revealing its wrath. I remember that first sign, a subtle shift in wind, almost imperceptible, carrying a cold scent of rain, the water changing from gentle green to a muted gray, reflecting the sky's uneasy mood. By midday, the clouds had gathered into low, heavy masses, moving with deliberate intent. The older sailors, those who had navigated these waters for decades, exchanged silent glances, their hands tightening on ropes, their feet braced against the deck. The air carried an electric tension, and I realized that the storm was not simply an event to endure. It was a force demanding attention, obedience, respect. I felt my pulse quicken, my stomach churn, yet a part of me thrilled at the imminent challenge, a mixture of fear and anticipation that would become a constant companion in my life at sea. The wind rose in gusts, lashing the sails, tugging at ropes, pulling the ship with a strength that made our muscles scream. The deck, once a steady plane beneath our feet, began to tilt, rising and falling with the swells. The oarsmen grunted in unison, muscles straining, voices raised above the roar of water and wind. Each command from the captain cut sharply through the chaos, a lifeline to which we clung. I remember gripping the ropes with hands already raw, feeling the spray slap my face, tasting salt in every breath, and wondering if the storm would carry us to safety or scatter us across the waves. The ship pitched violently, and the sound of timber groaning filled my ears. Barrels of oil shifted slightly, clinking, sending sharp reminders of the danger surrounding us. The waves rose like walls, each one threatening to engulf the galley, to drag it under the indifferent power of the Adriatic. I saw the fear in the eyes of younger sailors, men who had only known calm waters, and I felt my own fear mirrored in theirs. Yet the older men, steady as anchors, shouted instructions, secured cargo, and guided the ship with the calm certainty of experience. In that moment, I understood that courage is not the absence of fear, but the act of moving forward despite it. Hours passed, though time felt distorted, measured only by the pitch of the ship and the relentless wind. The storm seemed to stretch into eternity, waves towering and falling with a rhythm that mocked our efforts. I remember a particular swell, a dark green mountain that rose behind us, threatening to topple the galley. Every instinct screamed to brace, to hold, to obey the wind and the vessel as one. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the wave passed beneath us, the deck trembling, water sluicing off in violent sheets, leaving the air electric and charged with relief. During the lull, the silence was almost deafening. We clung to the ship as if it were a living creature, listening to its breaths, feeling the pulse of every plank and rope. The storm had passed temporarily, but the Adriatic remained restless, its surface a mirror of shifting gray skies and fleeting shadows. I lay on the wet deck for a few moments, letting the chill seep through my tunic, feeling the exhaustion of muscle and mind alike, and I realized how intimately the sea binds those who traverse it. A bond forged not in comfort, but in shared struggle, in survival, in the quiet understanding of mortality's proximity. Night fell with the storm fading into distant rumbles, and the Adriatic, though calmer, remained unforgiving. The lanterns swung, casting trembling circles of light, revealing the huddled crew, some tending to damaged sails, others adjusting ropes, a few simply staring into the darkness, listening to the residual moan of waves. I remember feeling a strange mixture of relief, pride, and unease. The storm had left its mark, the deck slick and battered, the air thick with salt and fatigue, and yet, amidst the destruction, there was beauty. A moon broke through the clouds, illuminating the crests of the rolling waves, casting silver ribbons across the restless water. In the aftermath, I understood something profound. Life at sea is never about triumph over nature. It is about recognition, adaptation, endurance, and respect. The storm reminded us that the sea gives and takes with equal indifference, rewarding caution and punishing hubris. And as I lay on the deck that night, muscles trembling, heart still racing, I felt the truth of the older sailors' silent lessons. The sea is eternal, vast, and indifferent, and those who venture upon it must surrender themselves to its rhythms, learning to move with its invisible currents, to anticipate its moods, and to find moments of awe amidst its fury. By dawn, the Adriatic had returned to a deceptive calm, the sky painted with pale pink and orange streaks. We were battered, exhausted, yet alive, and the ship, scarred but whole, sliced steadily through the water. I knew then that storms would become a part of life, not obstacles to fear, but tests of skill, patience, and endurance. And I began to recognize the subtle, unspoken camaraderie that formed between men who survived together, a bond stronger than any oath, forged in sweat, salt, and the relentless, undying pulse of the sea. The land, when it finally appeared after weeks at sea, seemed both a relief and a new kind of challenge. Ports were alive with motion, smells, and sounds that contrasted sharply with the monotony of the open water. The docks were crowded with merchants, porters, and laborers, their voices overlapping in a chaotic harmony of trade and negotiation. Horses neighed, ropes creaked, and the slap of waves against the piers added a constant percussion to the human clamor. For sailors like me, stepping onto solid ground was both grounding and disorienting. A sudden surge of energy and confusion after long hours of predictable rhythm aboard the galley. In these ports, the work was far from over. Cargo had to be unloaded, counted, and secured. Amphorae of oil and wine were stacked carefully on carts. Sacks of grain moved with careful balance, and everything was noted, checked, and rechecked. The porters and merchants had their own rules, subtle hierarchies, and quiet grudges. The older sailors moved among them with practiced ease, exchanging greetings and warnings, sometimes bargaining, sometimes silently observing. I followed, learning by mimicry, absorbing the cadence of life on land as carefully as I had learned the cadence of waves. And then there were the taverns. Here the world slowed, though not without its own risks. The smell of roasted meat, spilled wine, and smoke from cooking fires filled the air. Sailors gathered, exchanging tales, some true, some exaggerated, about distant lands, ghostly encounters, and near disasters at sea. Women moved among the tables, serving drinks or listening, or sometimes participating in the stories themselves. We ate and drank in moderation at first, cautious of indulgence, but eventually, the exhaustion of weeks at sea loosened restraint, and laughter and singing rose above the hum of conversation. I remember one evening in a small Sicilian port, the amber light of sunset falling across the tavern walls, mixing with the smoke and the smell of bread and wine. An older sailor told a story of a merchant ship that had vanished near Crete, lost in a sudden storm, its cargo of silk and spices swallowed entirely by the waves. We listened in silence, shivering slightly despite the warmth, imagining the faces of men we would never meet and the weight of goods that had disappeared into the depths. And then another man laughed, recounted a playful trick with a rival crew, and the moment passed, blending fear and amusement into the murky warmth of shared experience. Ports also carried risks beyond the natural world. Pickpockets, quarrels, drunken fights. Each harbor had its shadows. Sailors needed vigilance even on land, for trouble could arise quickly, and consequences at sea could be severe if a crew member disappeared or was injured. And yet, there was freedom too, a rare chance to stretch tired muscles, to breathe air untainted by the hold or the spray of the galley, to feel grass beneath sandals or stone beneath hands. I remember wandering along the quay, watching ships from distant lands, Carthaginian galleys with their dark hulls and high sterns, Greek merchantmen sleek and narrow, small fishing boats from local villages rocking gently in their moorings. The diversity of craft, the subtle differences in design, in rigging, in cargo fascinated me. Each told a story of a people, a place, a purpose, and I began to see the sea itself as a tapestry of these stories, woven together by currents, wind, and trade. Evenings often ended with quiet walks along the shore, listening to waves lap against the docks, observing lanterns reflected in the water, imagining the journey ahead. Conversations in the tavern gave way to contemplative silences, and sometimes I would find myself sitting alone, tracing the lines of masts and rigging against the night sky, remembering storms, the endless rhythm of oars, the camaraderie of sailors, and the boundless stretch of water still waiting beyond the horizon. In these ports, I learned much about people as well as about the sea. Traders negotiated with patience and cunning. Sailors exchanged knowledge of currents and winds. Children watched the unloading of cargo with wide-eyed fascination. Dogs scavenged near the water's edge. And everywhere, there was a sense of motion, a reminder that the world continued in countless directions, that life moved both slowly and abruptly, and that every stay ashore was merely another passage in a larger journey. By the time we returned to the ship, night had often fallen. Lanterns glimmered along the docks, and the smell of the sea mingled with the scents of the city. Our crew moved quietly, efficiently, knowing that the ship waited to return us to the waters, that tomorrow we would face wind, sun, and the endless horizon once more. And I carried with me the subtle awareness that the land, for all its allure, was only a temporary respite, that our true home was the rhythm of deck, oars, and sails, and that the sea, with its dangers and wonders, would always call us back. Our voyage to Alexandria was unlike any other. The farther east we sailed, the heavier the air seemed, carrying scents and stories that clung to the skin and clothes. The Nile's mouth drew us toward Egypt with its labyrinth of waters, and the distant outlines of the city rose like a promise on the horizon. White walls glimmering under the sun, minarets and towers catching the light, and the faint scent of spices drifting on the wind long before the shore came into view. Alexandria itself was a marvel that few words could capture. The harbor buzzed with activity. Ships from Greece, Phoenicia, Syria, and beyond jostling for space. Sailors shouting in dozens of tongues, porters rolling barrels, carrying crates, balancing amphorae with the skill of acrobats. The smell of incense, roasted meats, and foreign perfumes mingled with the briny odor of the sea. Markets overflowed with goods, exotic spices, woven silks, papyrus scrolls, fine pottery, and the occasional bundle of raw gems, glinting faintly under the sunlight. Even from the deck, I could hear the hum of negotiation, a low, constant drone that reminded me that commerce was the heartbeat of this city. Our cargo was carefully arranged, each amphora labeled, each bundle counted. For merchants in Rome expected precision, and mistakes could be costly. The older sailors moved among the hold with ease, checking lashings, adjusting ropes, ensuring that nothing would shift as the ship crossed back to Italian waters. I learned to watch them closely, noting how a small adjustment here, a tightened rope there, could prevent disaster weeks later. Every item carried weight beyond its physical mass. The pride of a merchant, the livelihood of families, the promise of coins that could change fortunes. Landing in Alexandria, we were met with a city that seemed almost alive, not only in the streets but in the air itself. The library, I heard, was a place of learning unmatched across the world, though I saw it only from a distance. Scholars and scribes moved like shadows along stone corridors, their hands tracing papyrus as though reading the secrets of the universe itself. Temples to gods both known and strange rose above the crowds, statues glinting in the sun, while priests performed rituals that echoed across the plazas. Everything was unfamiliar, every sound, every movement, every scent unfamiliar yet intoxicating, and I felt the simultaneous thrill and disorientation of being utterly out of place and completely absorbed. We spent hours in the harbor, unloading and receiving cargo. Workers moved swiftly, shouting instructions, exchanging goods, marking the amphorae with symbols we could barely understand. I watched a young boy, perhaps no older than I had been when I first boarded a ship, stacking jars with deft precision, his eyes wide with concentration. A merchant argued vehemently over a missing crate of saffron, gesturing in a language foreign to my ears, while a sailor beside me shrugged and muttered that the city thrived on such confusion. I learned to nod, to smile faintly, to absorb the scene without trying to master it, and in doing so, I began to understand the subtle lesson of Alexandria. Commerce and chaos coexist, inseparable, and both are essential to life. As night fell, the city transformed. Lanterns flickered along the docks, and torches burned along the streets. The calls of vendors softened into the background of distant music and laughter. Sailors sought taverns or quiet corners to rest, sharing meals of roasted grains, fish, and local vegetables. For a brief moment, I walked the streets, absorbing the alien beauty, listening to stories told by merchants of lands I had only imagined. The deserts of Arabia, the mountains of Armenia, the islands scattered across the eastern Mediterranean. Every tale carried a sense of longing, danger, and opportunity, reminding me that the world extended far beyond the horizon I had always known. Yet Alexandria was not merely a city of commerce. It was also a place of subtle perils. Pickpockets, opportunists, and the occasional band of thieves moved in the shadows, preying on those unfamiliar with the labyrinthine streets. And even amid the grandeur, there was a tension, the knowledge that the sea awaited, that our ship would carry us back, and that time ashore was always temporary. I felt it keenly, a mixture of fascination and impatience, eager to explore yet conscious that the rhythm of the ocean would not wait for idle curiosity. When we finally set sail, leaving the pyramids and bustling markets behind. The air felt heavier with both exhaustion and wonder. The hold was full, the crew tired but vigilant, and the ship cut through the water with a steady determination. I leaned on the railing, watching Alexandria shrink behind us, its lights flickering like fireflies, and I understood a truth I would carry for the rest of my life. Every port is a lesson, every cargo a story, and every voyage an opportunity to witness the world beyond the familiar, to feel its vastness, its dangers, and its fleeting, brilliant beauty. The sea, for all its beauty and rhythm, carries dangers that do not announce themselves with warning bells or signs. The threat of pirates was never far from the minds of seasoned sailors, whispered in low tones over mugs of diluted wine, traced in the lines of maps, marked by rumors passed from port to port. I had heard these tales before Alexandria, but it was only on the return voyage that I began to understand them in their full, insistent gravity. It began subtly. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the horizon bled orange into violet, a small glint caught my eye. A sail far off, low on the water, moving swiftly, too swiftly, and with a strange stealth that made my stomach twist. I pointed it out, and the older sailors fell silent, eyes narrowing, hands adjusting grips on ropes. The captain ordered the ship to adjust its course slightly, slow and deliberate, while men took positions, checking oars and preparing for sudden maneuvers. Every instinct told us that the distant vessel was no ordinary trader, but a predator, a shadow stalking the currents. That night, sleep was impossible. The creak of the ship, the whisper of waves, and the distant sound of the wind against sails became an orchestra of tension. The stars were bright, reflected sharply in the black water, and every ripple seemed suspicious. We kept watch in shifts, eyes scanning the horizon, listening to the soft slap of oars, the faint creak of ropes, and the occasional cry of seabirds startled by our movement. The thrill of adventure was tinged with fear, an intoxicating mixture that made hearts pound and palms sweat. When the pirates finally appeared, it was sudden and terrifying. 3 vessels, dark and narrow, emerged from the horizon, cutting through the water with a predator's efficiency. Their sails were blackened, their oars strong, and I saw men crouched along the decks, eyes gleaming with intent, weapons glinting faintly in the moonlight. The captain barked orders, the crew scrambled, and I felt my muscles respond almost instinctively, gripping ropes, adjusting sails, preparing for a confrontation that might decide life or death. The chase was a study in controlled chaos. Waves rose beneath us, tossing the galley, testing every lash, every knot, every ounce of strength we possessed. The pirates were relentless, cutting across currents and following our movements with terrifying precision. I remember the sound of splintering wood as one of their oars struck a loose crate, the shouts and curses of men strained against the wind, and the raw, unyielding tension of knowing that failure meant capture, or worse. Every decision mattered. Every subtle adjustment of sail or oar could be the difference between survival and disaster. Hours passed, though they stretched into eternity. We maneuvered, doubled back, adjusted course, and pushed the galley to its limits. The older sailors moved with a calm that belied the danger, their experience guiding them through instinct and memory. I followed orders, my hands raw, my body trembling from exertion, my mind consumed with the thought of the predators behind us and the distance to safety ahead. And somewhere amid the fear, there was a strange exhilaration, a pure, unfiltered awareness of life and survival, a sense of being alive in a way that only imminent danger can induce. Finally, with a combination of skill, luck, and the favor of the currents, we managed to outmaneuver the pirates. The wind shifted just enough, the waves broke at the perfect angle, and our galley pulled ahead, leaving them to vanish into the horizon. their cries fading into the night. Exhaustion and relief collided, our bodies shaking from strain, yet a subtle camaraderie enveloped us. A shared understanding that we had survived together, relying on instinct, cooperation, and courage. In the aftermath, the crew worked silently, repairing minor damage, checking the cargo, and adjusting the rigging. The adrenaline faded, replaced by a slow, steady awareness of our mortality and our reliance on one another. That night, as I lay on the deck staring at the vast, unending sky, I realized that the sea's beauty and terror are inseparable, that every voyage carries risk and reward intertwined, and that to be a sailor is to accept this delicate balance with every breath and every heartbeat. Even as we sailed toward familiar waters, the shadow of the pirates lingered. Their presence was a reminder that the sea is never truly safe, that vigilance must never waver, and that the line between triumph and disaster is as thin and unpredictable as the edge of a wave. I fell asleep eventually, muscles aching, hands still trembling, mind racing with both fear and awe, knowing that the sea had taught me yet another lesson, one of survival, strategy, and the ever-present, ever-patient shadow that follows those who dare to cross her waters. The sea, even after the threat of pirates faded, never lost its power to teach vigilance. Nights brought a different kind of danger. Sudden squalls, rolling fog, the subtle shift of currents invisible to the eye yet powerful enough to steer a ship off course. It was during one such night, several days past the Adriatic, that I began to understand the profound skill required to navigate under the stars, to read the sky and waves as one reads a familiar book. The evening had been calm, the sun melting slowly behind the horizon, casting streaks of gold and violet across the water. Lanterns on deck glimmered faintly, illuminating the creases of exhausted faces and the taut lines of sails ready for the next challenge. We were heading south, toward the open waters of the Ionian Sea, and for a brief moment, the crew relaxed, sharing murmured jokes and the occasional whispered story of distant ports. Yet, the older sailors, eyes never leaving the horizon, had already noted the change. A subtle cooling of the wind, the faint shimmer of an approaching cloud bank, a shift in the movement of the waves. By midnight, the storm arrived without ceremony. A chill swept across the deck, gusts tugging violently at sails, flinging spray across the prow. Waves rose and fell, their crests catching the dim starlight, shadows and silver entwined in restless motion. I gripped the ropes with raw hands, muscles burning, mind straining to follow instructions shouted over the roar of wind and water. The captain's voice, commanding and precise, cut through the chaos, directing the crew with a calm born of experience. The older sailors adjusted the oars, the sails, the cargo, anticipating each wave before it struck, while I struggled to match their rhythm, to become part of the vessel's living response to the storm. It was during this night that I first truly understood the stars as guides. In the brief lulls between gusts, I could trace constellations, the familiar patterns of Ursa Major and Orion, the subtle flicker of distant planets. Each point of light became a marker, a compass, a reassurance that despite the chaos below, the universe remained constant. I learned to measure the ship's heading by the angle of the stars, to estimate distance traveled through observation of celestial movement, and to sense my location when fog and rain obscured the horizon. The skill demanded patience, keen observation, and a mind free from distraction. Yet it brought an almost meditative clarity, a connection to forces larger than myself, both celestial and aquatic. Hours stretched interminably. The storm seemed to exist outside of time, each wave and gust folding into the next, each shout and command echoing endlessly across the water. I felt simultaneously exhausted and hyper-aware, my senses stretched to the limits of perception. The deck was slick with rain, the ropes bite into my palms, and yet I felt a strange exhilaration, a pure, unfiltered awareness of life at its most immediate, raw, and demanding. Every decision, every movement carried consequences not just for myself, but for the ship and the men around me. Morning arrived slowly, filtered through the gray clouds and lingering rain. The storm, though waning, left its mark. The deck slick and scarred, the sails torn in places, the cargo shifted slightly but intact. We worked silently, adjusting, repairing, securing, our movements methodical and precise, almost ritualistic in their repetition. In the brief intervals between labor, I would glance upward, noting the sun breaking through the clouds, the stars fading from view, and feel the immense gratitude of having survived another night at sea. These experiences taught more than skill or survival. They taught respect. The sea is indifferent, powerful, and eternal. Storms test patience, courage, and unity. The stars offer guidance, yet only to those who truly observe. And time, so familiar on land, becomes elastic at sea. Minutes stretch into hours, nights feel endless, and days pass in patterns dictated not by clocks but by waves, wind, and celestial motion. I began to understand the subtle rhythm that binds sailors across generations, a shared language of movement, observation, and endurance that transcends words. By the end of that passage, my understanding of the world had shifted. I no longer perceived the sea as merely a path or obstacle. It was a teacher, a mirror, a force shaping mind and body alike. Navigation was no longer about reaching a destination. It was about awareness, presence, and harmony with currents, wind, and stars. And though exhaustion and fear were constant companions, so too were awe, wonder, and the quiet thrill of mastery slowly gained through observation, patience, and experience. After weeks at sea, the horizon offered a shape both familiar and impossible. The outline of land, jagged and shadowed, yet unlike any port we had seen. It was small, almost hidden, with cliffs rising sharply from the water, their surfaces dark and glistening with moisture. A thin plume of smoke curled into the sky from the interior, and the distant cry of birds suggested life. Yet the island seemed untouched by the rhythm of trade or civilization. The captain ordered a cautious approach, and the crew leaned over rails and oars, eyes straining to see what might await us. As we drew nearer, the details became sharper. Dense vegetation covered most of the slopes, a tangle of green that hinted at tropical abundance. Strange flowers, with colors too vivid to be natural, peeked through thick leaves, and the scent carried across the waves. A perfume so sharp it made my head swim. Rocks jutted unpredictably from the shore, requiring careful navigation to avoid wrecking the galley. I felt a shiver of excitement and unease, knowing that this land was both an opportunity and a potential trap. Landing required patience. The tide pulled and pushed, threatening to dash us against the rocks, and the currents shifted with deceptive subtlety. We tied ropes, guided the prow, and finally secured the ship in a small cove, shallow and protected. The oarsmen rested briefly, muscles taut from exertion, eyes scanning the unfamiliar landscape. I stepped onto the sand cautiously, feeling the texture of tiny shells and coarse grains beneath my sandals, listening to the faint rustle of leaves in the dense foliage behind us. The interior of the island was both magical and disconcerting. Trees stretched tall, their trunks thick and gnarled, roots twisting across the ground like serpents. Vines hung low, some bearing fruits with skins iridescent in the sunlight, their scent intoxicating. Birds of strange colors flitted between branches, calling in high, piercing tones, while insects buzzed in rhythmic patterns that felt almost musical. Every step forward revealed something new, a hidden flower, a glimmer of water beneath the undergrowth, the occasional flash of movement suggesting unseen creatures watching us. The inhabitants, if they could be called that, emerged gradually. At first, only shadows among the trees, then glimpses of figures, their skin painted with patterns that mimicked the surroundings, moving with a fluidity that suggested deep knowledge of the land. They watched us, silent and curious, and though we tried gestures of peace, their expressions were enigmatic, neither welcoming nor threatening. I sensed a profound intelligence, an awareness of the sea as much as the land, an awareness born from generations of isolation. We explored carefully, gathering fresh water from a stream and observing the plants, noting edible fruits and herbs. I marveled at the contrast between the wild abundance and the meticulous attention the inhabitants seemed to pay to the environment, as though every plant, every rock, every creature had its place in a delicate balance. The older sailors moved cautiously, ever alert to danger, yet respectful, sensing the importance of restraint in a place untouched by commerce or conquest. Evening approached quickly, the shadows lengthening, colors of the island deepening into reds and purples as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Fires flickered in the distant village, small and contained, and the smoke carried a sweet, unfamiliar scent. I could hear faint chants, rhythmic and low, rising from the interior, blending with the calls of nocturnal creatures. The atmosphere was thick with mystery, a sense of history and ritual beyond our understanding, and I felt both awe and humility. By the time we returned to the ship, the island had left an imprint on my mind. Its existence was a reminder that the world contains more than trade routes, ports, and known civilizations. There are pockets of life, entirely separate from the rhythms we take for granted, shaped by forces and patterns unseen, governed by rules older than Rome itself. And as the galley slid away from the cove, cutting through water still shimmering with sunset, I carried with me a sense of reverence, a recognition that exploration is not merely about claiming land or cargo, but about witnessing, understanding, and learning from the unfamiliar. The sea welcomed us back with calm waves, though the image of the island lingered in every glance at the horizon. I realized that such encounters change a sailor's subtly shifting perception, expanding curiosity, and deepening respect for the vast, mysterious world that stretches beyond any single voyage. And I knew, even as the stars rose and guided us onward, that the memory of that island, strange, vibrant, and alive, would remain with me through every storm, every port, every crossing yet to come. The sea carries more than water. It carries stories. Stories passed from lip to lip, whispered over cups of thin wine, shouted across decks in the wind, or murmured quietly as lanterns flicker in the hold. After our encounter with the strange island, I found myself listening more intently to these tales, hungry for the experiences of men who had traversed the Mediterranean long before I ever set foot on a galley. Every sailor seemed to carry fragments of worlds I could barely imagine, stitched together in a tapestry of danger, wonder, and fleeting beauty. One evening, anchored near a small harbor on the coast of Crete, an older mariner named Marcus shared a story that left me wide-eyed. He spoke of a ship that vanished near the Cyclades, swallowed by a sudden fog that rolled in without warning, dense and silent, hiding jagged rocks and currents that tore vessels apart. Yet, he said, some sailors survived, finding themselves on an island covered in black sands, where the water boiled as though alive and birds circled endlessly, guiding them toward hidden freshwater streams. His voice was calm, almost reverent, as if recounting not a tale of peril, but a ritual lesson, a reminder that survival depends on attentiveness, courage, and a certain willingness to surrender to the sea's unpredictable will. Another sailor spoke of storms in the Aegean so fierce that the waves seemed to climb like mountains, curling above the mastheads, and the sky black with anger. He described how men clung to every rope, every spar, until their muscles burned, and even then, exhaustion threatened to drown them before the water could. And yet, after the tempest passed, he would say, there was a kind of beauty in the aftermath. The water glittered with sunlit spray, the horizon stretched endlessly, and every breath taken felt like a gift earned through struggle. These stories were both warnings and inspirations, illustrations of risk, skill, and the fragile triumph of life over chaos. At times, the tales veered into the strange and uncanny. A man from Phoenicia claimed to have seen a glowing figure beneath the water, guiding his ship through a treacherous passage near Sicily. Another swore that the stars themselves shifted, subtly but unmistakably, to signal danger, and that those who ignored their patterns were doomed to misfortune. Some laughed at such tales, dismissing them as superstition. Yet the old men's eyes betrayed a respect, a hint that they too had witnessed phenomena beyond the comprehension of those who lived only on land. The tales were not merely about danger. They were about culture, curiosity, and the endless variety of human experience. Sailors spoke of ports where musicians played haunting melodies that echoed across the water, of markets overflowing with goods unimaginable, rare spices, shimmering fabrics, delicate glassware, and of people whose language, dress, and customs were entirely alien, yet connected to us through trade, negotiation, and shared need. They described festivals, religious rituals, and customs that made a simple landing an adventure of perception, a reminder that civilization itself is a mosaic, each piece contributing to a world far larger than any single port or voyage. I found myself sharing in these experiences as though I had witnessed them firsthand. I imagined the swells, the colors, the scents, the voices, and I realized that storytelling is a vessel as crucial as the ship itself. Each tale carries wisdom. How to survive, how to anticipate, how to read subtle signs, how to respect the sea and the people who inhabit its shores. And even as I listened, I felt the stirrings of anticipation, the desire to encounter my own extraordinary moments, to gather stories that would ripple across decks and ports in years to come. Some nights we would sit on deck, the galley gently rocking, the stars reflected in the calm water, and a dozen sailors would trade anecdotes in low voices. The laughter, the gasps, the sighs became part of the rhythm of the night, a living testament to the connectivity of the Mediterranean. We were isolated from land, yet bound to every shore by the invisible threads of human experience. And I understood that these tales, as much as skill with oars or sails, shaped a sailor imparting caution, insight, and the subtle art of observation. I began to collect them in my memory, silently cataloging ports, phenomena, and customs. When storms arose or nights stretched into endless darkness, I recalled these stories, a reminder that knowledge exists beyond maps and compasses, carried instead in voices, expressions, and the accumulated wisdom of those who have endured the sea's capricious embrace. And with each tale, I felt a deepening sense of belonging, not merely to my own journey, but to the ongoing, unbroken narrative of sailors who have crossed these waters, leaving fragments of themselves in every port and wave, in every story told and retold across time. The sea is deceptively calm when it chooses to be, and it is in such moments that danger often hides. We were sailing near the western coast of Crete, a stretch of water known to harbor treacherous reefs just beneath the surface, invisible until they claimed ships or tore sails from unsuspecting crews. I had heard the warnings from older sailors, hushed tales of vessels dashed against jagged rock, cargo lost, lives ended. Yet nothing prepares you fully until you confront it yourself. It began with a subtle shift in the water. The swell, previously gentle, became uneven, a faint irregularity that tugged at the galley in unexpected ways. The oarsman paused, sensing something off, and the captain's voice, sharp but controlled, cut through the quiet hum of preparation. We adjusted course slightly, scanning the horizon and the surface of the water, searching for telltale signs. Every ripple, every shadow, every change in the reflection of sunlight on the waves became a potential warning. And then it appeared, a dark, jagged line beneath the water, stretching like a trap across our path. The reef was hidden enough to have caught many a seasoned sailor unaware, its black rocks glinting faintly in the sunlight as the waves broke over them. Time seemed to slow. The oarsmen tensed, gripping their seats, eyes fixed on the shifting water. The sails were adjusted, the rudder steered with utmost precision, and I felt my heart hammer in my chest. One wrong move, one misjudged current, and we would be smashed against stone, our cargo destroyed, our lives hanging by a thread. Every maneuver was deliberate. The older sailors gave commands in a language of brevity and clarity, each word weighted with urgency. Starboard, hard, wait for the swell. My hands were raw on the ropes, muscles trembling from strain, yet my mind sharpened, every sense attuned to the slightest change in water, wind, and movement of the vessel. The galley responded like a living creature, tilting, adjusting, rising over waves that threatened to cast us sideways into the hidden menace below. The reef stretched longer than expected, winding unpredictably as though the sea itself had drawn it with malice. We followed its contour cautiously, learning to read subtle differences in color, the texture of breaking waves, and the occasional glint of rock beneath the surface. The sun beat down mercilessly, the spray stung our faces, and the rhythm of oars and voices became a focused harmony of survival. In those hours, I understood the delicate balance of skill, observation, and instinct required to navigate safely. By midday, we had cleared the worst of the reef, though the threat had not entirely disappeared. Every glance behind revealed the shadowy line beneath the water, a constant reminder of the peril we had narrowly avoided. We worked silently after that, adjusting cargo, checking lashings, and repairing minor damage inflicted by the turbulent waters. Even in relief, there was an awareness that the sea carries consequences beyond immediate perception, that hidden dangers can lurk anywhere, and that respect is the only true safeguard. The reef taught lessons not just in navigation, but in patience and perception. It reminded me that vigilance must never waver, that every ripple, every shadow, every glimmer of light is a potential signal, and that experience alone is insufficient without careful observation. I began to notice patterns, learning to read the water as a map, a language written in movement, light, and resistance. Each encounter strengthened my bond with the galley, my awareness of my own limitations, and my understanding of the fragile balance between survival and catastrophe. Even after we sailed beyond the reef, the memory of its jagged, hidden teeth lingered. It shaped my perception of the sea, making each calm stretch a canvas for vigilance, each wave a possible warning, and each journey a delicate negotiation between skill, chance, and patience. The crew moved with renewed awareness, their movements precise, their voices quieter, yet more deliberate. And I, Lucius, began to feel the subtle transformation that life at sea imparts. An ever-deepening understanding that the sea is both a teacher and a challenge, and that survival depends on humility, observation, and the silent harmony between vessel, crew, and water. After navigating past the hidden reef, we set our sights on Rhodes, a bustling hub of trade and maritime skill. The island rose from the sea like a fortress, white walls gleaming under the afternoon sun, towers punctuating the skyline, and ships of every shape and size clustered in the harbor. The air was thick with the sense of salt, spices, and the faint tang of metal from the forges, a reminder that Rhodes was not merely a waypoint, but a center of commerce, diplomacy, and subtle intrigue. It was here that we encountered Gaius Marcellus, a merchant of considerable reputation. His reputation preceded him, carried by whispers among sailors, traders, and even minor officials. Known for his knowledge of rare goods, his network of contacts stretching across the Mediterranean, and his uncanny ability to anticipate market fluctuations, he was both admired and feared. When we docked, he was waiting, a lean man with sharp eyes and hands that suggested both dexterity and authority. He greeted our captain with a curt nod and then turned his gaze toward me, offering a subtle smile that hinted at an invitation into a world beyond mere trade in amphory and grain. The conversation began with the usual formalities: greetings, inquiries about our voyage, interest in cargo, but quickly evolved into a lesson in subtlety and observation. Marcellus spoke of spices from India, rare fabrics from the Levant, delicate glassware from Syrian artisans, and even papyrus scrolls containing knowledge considered precious beyond measure. He explained, almost casually, that success in commerce depended not just on wealth, but on understanding people, reading intentions, and sometimes acting before opportunity fully revealed itself. His words were measured, each sentence layered with implication, and I realized that I was witnessing not merely a transaction, but an education in strategy, negotiation, and the quiet power of influence. We spent days navigating the labyrinthine docks of Rhodes, observing trades, assisting where necessary, and learning the unspoken rules that governed the exchange of goods. Every handshake, every smile, every glance carried meaning. A misstep could result in lost cargo, damaged reputation, or even physical danger in a world where competition could turn violent. Marcellus, however, moved with grace, ensuring that his presence commanded respect without intimidation, an embodiment of skill tempered by experience. Beyond the practical lessons, Rhodes offered insight into the subtle art of connection. We visited warehouses filled with exotic goods, watched artisans at work, and listened to stories of traders who had journeyed from lands that existed only in maps or rumor. Each encounter, each observation, expanded my understanding of commerce not as a simple exchange of goods, but as a network of influence, trust, and carefully managed perception. I began to see that every decision, no matter how small, could ripple across ports, markets, and even distant lands, and that the true mastery of trade lay as much in anticipation as in execution. Evenings in Rhodes brought another dimension entirely. The harbor lanterns reflected in the water, casting dancing light across masts and sails. Tavern doors opened to reveal musicians, the low hum of conversation, and the occasional heated debate over profits, politics, and reputation. Sailors and merchants mingled, sharing stories that blurred the line between fact and legend. I found myself listening, absorbing not only information about trade but also the rhythms of human interaction, the subtle cues, the gestures, the timing of words and silences that defined influence and negotiation. Our departure from Rhodes was both relief and temptation. Relief, because the work of commerce and navigation demanded continuous effort, leaving little room for indulgence. Temptation, because the lessons and connections gained promised opportunities that extended far beyond a single voyage. Marcellus had shared more than knowledge of goods and ports. He had imparted insight into perception, patience, and the nuanced power of observation, skills as vital on the deck of a ship as they were in a crowded marketplace. As we sailed toward the next leg of our journey, the sun dipping behind the horizon, I reflected on the lessons of Rhodes. The world was vast, interconnected, and layered with both visible and hidden forces. Survival at sea required skill, courage, and endurance. Success in trade required perception, subtlety, and patience. And I, Lucius, was beginning to see that the life of a sailor and merchant was inseparable. That the sea, the ports, and the people together formed a continuum, each shaping experience, character, and destiny. Sailing eastward from Rhodes, the sun warmed our backs as the coastline of Ephesus emerged, white columns and terraced streets glinting in the morning light. The city was alive in a way that contrasted sharply with the quiet tension of the open sea. Traders, pilgrims, and sailors filled the streets, moving with purpose yet swaying to an unseen rhythm. The scent of roasted meats, incense, and the salt of the nearby harbor mingled in the air, forming an olfactory map of anticipation and celebration. We arrived during the Festival of Artemis, a grand occasion that drew people from across the Mediterranean. I had seen smaller religious gatherings before, but nothing compared to the scale and coordination here. Streets were lined with merchants selling fruits, textiles, and trinkets. Performers played flutes, drums, and lyres, their music blending into a continuous hum that seemed to pulse through the city. The temple itself, towering and majestic, held ceremonies that I observed from the steps, witnessing the rhythmic dance of priests and priestesses, the offering of sacrifices, and the solemn chants that echoed off stone walls. Among the crowd, I noticed details that might escape a casual observer. The way children clutched small charms and coins, eyes wide with excitement and curiosity. How merchants subtly adjusted prices and gestures depending on who approached their stalls. How performers communicated silently with nods and glances, orchestrating their movements to captivate the audience. Every element of the festival, from the grand rituals to the smallest interactions, seemed both deliberate and spontaneous, a reflection of human energy channeled into celebration, devotion, and spectacle. I wandered with the crew through the marketplace, tasting unfamiliar fruits, marveling at fabrics dyed in vibrant, impossible colors, and listening to merchants speak of distant lands. India, Persia, the shores of Africa. Their stories were punctuated by laughter, the occasional dispute, and the ever-present background rhythm of the festival, music, movement, and the occasional cheer from the temple steps. Even among strangers, there was an unspoken camaraderie. Shared glances, exchanged nods, and the recognition that we were participants in something larger than ourselves. At night, the city transformed again. Torches flickered along the streets, casting long shadows against the stone, and the music became more intimate, blending with laughter, conversation, and the distant roar of celebratory fires. Sailors mingled with locals, exchanging stories and coins, tasting dishes they could never have imagined, and absorbing lessons about culture, ritual, and human ingenuity. I felt the subtle pulse of a city alive with history, commerce, and devotion, and I began to understand that ports and festivals were as much a part of a sailor's journey as the waves and winds themselves. Even in the midst of celebration, there was vigilance. Crowds could conceal thieves, storms could strike suddenly, and tensions between visiting traders and locals sometimes erupted into conflict. We moved with quiet awareness, observing, learning, and participating without losing sight of the ever-present sea waiting beyond the harbor. Each day, each interaction, sharpened perception, honed instinct, and deepened understanding of the delicate balance between immersion and caution. By the time we departed Ephesus, the festival fading behind us, I carried with me not only stories and souvenirs, but a heightened awareness of the interconnectedness of culture, trade, and human expression. The rhythms of city life, the vibrancy of celebration, and the rituals of devotion were as instructive as the charts, sails, and stars that guided us at sea. And as our galley cut through the gentle waves, I reflected on the contrast between the wild, unpredictable energy of the festival and the steady, disciplined pulse of life aboard a ship, two worlds, both shaping my understanding, both indispensable to the journey that stretched endlessly ahead. We sailed along the southern coast of Anatolia, near Lycia, when the sea began to change with a quiet subtlety that only experience could detect. The wind shifted imperceptibly at first, brushing our faces with a cooler edge than the day before. The swells lengthened, stretching across the horizon with a slow, deliberate cadence. The older sailors exchanged glances, hands tightening on ropes and oars, and I felt a low, thrumming tension settle over the crew, a prelude to the chaos the ocean often hides until it is ready to claim attention. By mid-afternoon, the clouds had gathered, low and heavy, their undersides bruised with gray and violet, moving with a deliberate patience that felt almost predatory. The sun, once a warm companion, disappeared behind their masts, and shadows deepened across the deck, the water, and the horizon. A sharp gust tore across the galley, pulling at sails, snapping ropes, and sending a fine spray of salt across the skin. Orders were shouted with clarity, voices raised above the growl of the wind, and men scrambled to secure the cargo and adjust the rigging. Night descended like a cloak, yet the storm did not diminish. Waves rose into mountainous forms, black beneath the sparse moonlight, crashing against the hull with relentless force. I clung to a rope, muscles trembling, every sense honed to the rhythm of the galley's movements. The oarsmen strained in unison, countering the current's fury, while the captain and older sailors directed each maneuver with the precision of musicians conducting an orchestra of chaos. Fear and exhilaration intertwined. The sea was both adversary and teacher, exacting a toll while imparting knowledge impossible to gain elsewhere. Rain lashed against faces and bodies, a relentless curtain of cold, and the wind carried the scent of distant land and brine, mingling with the metallic tang of effort and strain. Each wave seemed to test endurance, rocking the ship with increasing intensity, threatening to tear it apart. I learned to anticipate the swell, to feel it through the timbre of sound, the subtle lift of the deck, the way the ropes hummed under tension. Survival depended not on panic but on precise timing, unwavering coordination, and the silent trust among men whose lives were inextricably linked. Hours passed, yet felt like days. Darkness, rain, and wind blurred into a continuous trial, testing patience, skill, and endurance. Men spoke little, communication reduced to urgent shouts and terse gestures. Every decision carried weight. Every slight miscalculation could have catastrophic consequences. I watched the captain move like a shadow, his eyes scanning, calculating, guiding, embodying calm in the storm's unrelenting roar. The older sailors moved with practiced grace, adjusting lines, shifting weight, and predicting the sea's unpredictable movements. Dawn arrived slowly, a dim light diffused through clouds and mist. The storm had begun to wane, leaving a sea still turbulent but less violent, the air thick with moisture and the scent of earth carried from distant shores. The crew moved methodically, checking the hull, securing cargo, and tending to minor injuries, the exhaustion etched on every face. And yet, amid the fatigue, there was a subtle triumph, a quiet acknowledgement that we had endured, survived, and learned once more the rhythm of sea and ship. The storm off Lycia became a memory that lingered with weight and texture. I understood that storms were teachers, cruel, relentless, and uncompromising. They demanded respect, observation, and endurance, imparting lessons in both technique and character. Each encounter strengthened not only skill but resolve, a quiet insistence that the sea, for all its beauty and bounty, remains indifferent and infinitely powerful. As we sailed toward calmer waters, I reflected on the storm's imprint. It had revealed weaknesses, tested patience, and highlighted the subtleties of trust between crew and captain, between men and ship. And as the coast of Lycia receded, bathed in morning light, I realized that every voyage carries such trials, some hidden, some sudden, all shaping the way a sailor perceives the vast, shifting world that stretches beyond any horizon, beyond any known map, beyond any human expectation. After surviving the storm off Lycia, our captain decided it was wiser to join a merchant fleet bound for the ports of southern Anatolia and ultimately toward the western Mediterranean. The sight of multiple galleys aligned, cutting through the morning haze like a coordinated pulse across the water, was both reassuring and intimidating. Each ship bore its own cargo, crew, and purpose, yet all moved with an implicit rhythm, a delicate choreography dictated by currents, wind, and collective experience. The dynamics of the fleet were subtle and complex. Captains exchanged nods and signals, some verbal, some using flags and oars, coordinating speed and course with a precision that suggested decades of combined knowledge. Ships tacked together when the wind shifted, adjusted formations to avoid treacherous shoals, and maintained distance to prevent collision during sudden gusts. I observed how discipline and observation intertwined. One careless move could disrupt the fleet's balance, endangering cargo, men, and the fragile harmony of multiple vessels navigating as a single organism. Among the fleet, competition and collaboration coexisted uneasily. Sailors shared news of ports, dangers, and opportunities, yet each captain guarded information that could yield profit or strategic advantage. I witnessed subtle negotiations, whispered bargains on deck, and the occasional tense exchange over passage rights or shared anchorages. There was a constant undercurrent of observation, assessment, and calculation, a web of alliances and rivalries that required both diplomacy and intuition. The older sailors advised me to watch closely, to note who spoke to whom, the timing of gestures, the tone of replies, all revealing hidden layers of influence and hierarchy within the fleet. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sea in gold and violet, we anchored near a sheltered bay with the fleet. Fires flickered on decks, lanterns swayed gently, and sailors moved with familiar rhythms, tending ropes, repairing sails, and sharing meals of salted fish, bread, and fruit. Around the fires, stories were exchanged. Tales of storms, pirate attacks, rare goods, and strange ports, layered with exaggeration, humor, and lessons hidden within narrative. I found myself listening intently, noting patterns, learning to discern truth from embellishment, understanding that every story carried insight into human nature, maritime skill, and commerce. The days that followed were a mixture of routine and tension. We sailed in formation, adjusting sails, trimming oars, and maintaining course with constant attention. At night, lanterns flickered across the fleet like constellations mirrored on the water, and every captain kept watch, eyes scanning the darkness for unseen hazards or distant sails. I felt both the safety and vulnerability inherent in traveling with others, a collective strength, yet a shared exposure to threats, where the failure of one could imperil all. During these passages, I learned the subtle communication of fleets, the interplay of signals, the timing of maneuvers, and the observation of every detail from wind shifts to wave patterns. Each day brought new challenges. Sudden squalls that tested coordination, rival traders attempting to navigate the same waters, and the constant need to anticipate, adapt, and maintain vigilance. I realized that the sea's lessons were magnified when shared, each ship both a companion and a mirror, reflecting skill, caution, and human ingenuity across the water. By the time we reached the next major port, I carried with me an expanded understanding of cooperation, hierarchy, and the delicate balance of shared endeavor. The merchant fleet had revealed not only practical skills, navigation, signaling, and seamanship, but also an awareness of human behavior under pressure, the subtle currents of influence, trust, and rivalry that shape every interaction. And as the galley glided into harbor, sails damp but crew steady, I recognized that the sea is not merely a solitary journey but also a complex web of relationships, each voyage a lesson in both survival and the intricate dance of human enterprise.